presentation. My name is Helen. I am Head of Employment Programs at Breaking Barriers. I'm thrilled to be here today alongside my colleague Toby, Senior Impact and Innovation Manager. Together, we're delighted to share with you our findings on the impact of one-to-one support session on entering employment for our clients. Since launching in 2015, Breaking Barriers has published annually how many of our clients have successfully entered employment. However, we've never previously been able to precisely estimate how likely a client was to get a job because of Breaking Barriers support. And this presentation is our first attempt to exploring this question. This is what we'll go through today. I will start with a quick introduction about Breaking Barriers, our support, and our one-to-one model. Toby will then take over and walk us through the report, covering the research model, findings, and next steps. We will have time at the end for any questions, so please feel free to put them in the chat. Please keep your mics on mute. We'll be recording the presentation, so feel free to turn off your camera if you don't want to be recorded. And if everybody is good to go, I will start with a quick introduction about BB. Yeah, next slide. So Breaking Barriers exists so every refugee can access meaningful employment and build a new life. Refugees flee war, violence, persecution, and climate crisis, yet once they're in the UK, they face many more barriers, which excludes them from society and from the job market. And barriers include anything from a long gap in the CV, racism, discrimination, a lack of awareness, lack of English language skills, and many more. And this is why Breaking Barriers exists, or we come in. We were founded in 2015 in response to the lack of effective and comprehensive employment support for refugees. Our mission is very straightforward, and that is to help refugees to acquire the knowledge, confidence, and experience they need to get stable, fulfilling employment. We give a central role to businesses, involving them directly in finding employment solutions and providing support to get refugees into work. We currently support refugees in London, Birmingham, and Manchester, with very exciting plans to expand our delivery to Liverpool and Glasgow in the late summer. Our support includes employment advice and guidance, education, and corporate partnerships. And I'll talk to you about each of them in a bit of detail in the next slide. Great. So this is a slide to show you the different elements or moving parts of what we call support at Breaking Barriers. So in the blue, the left corner, you have employment, and this includes information, advice, and guidance, or one-to-one advice and guidance. And this is delivered by our expert employment advisors and trained volunteers. And this includes anything from CV writing, so preparing for a job, staying in a job, and also acquiring higher education needs. And the sessions are offered online or face-to-face and can be done by an employment advisor or trained volunteers. And we've recently introduced an 8 to 10 week structured training packages. So that would be the top one there. The first one is, it covers employment foundation programs, and the other one is on digital skills training. And they cover topics that are fundamental to our clients' journey in their search for employment. And then on the bottom left, you have the skills building section. And this one is skills-based volunteering to draw on the expertise of our corporate volunteers. And they support our clients on their journey to employment. And the activities include workshops conducted by our volunteers, mentoring, so our clients and corporate volunteers, where they get paired and have a few sessions. And then also job opportunities, work experience, shadowing, where our clients get partnered with businesses to help them in their employment journey. And then on the right, in the yellow box, we have education support. So English classes, IT classes, delivered again by trained volunteer teachers and designed to complement the state-funded provision. So all of our education classes are designed to complement our employment support. And we have courses ranging anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks that build on English language skills and other employability skills. And mainly the classes are group sessions, and we do have some one-to-one support offered. And all of the sessions are mostly online, and we've gradually started the reintroduction of face-to-face classes as well. And then at the bottom, in the white box, you have other supports that we provide. So funding for training, education, and exams through our grants program. And then we've also recently started the provision of laptops and other tech devices. So in summary, these are the different activities that we engage in and how we aim to support our clients. The session today will mostly focus on our one-to-one support, and this is where we will talk more about it. And if you go to the next slide, Danielle, please. Cool. So at the core of Breaking Barriers support for our refugees, our one-to-one employment support is, or what we refer to, advice and guidance session, or IAGs, are the main bread and butter of what we do at Breaking Barriers. Appointments that take place, these are appointments that take place to achieve a specific task that will help a client to progress towards their goals. And this could be working on a CV, practicing digital skills, making a college application. As I said earlier, anything from preparing for a job, getting a job, and staying in a job. And these IAGs can take place remotely or in person, depending on the client's preference. And yeah, so I'm going to now hand over to my colleague, Toby. He's a Senior Impact and Innovation Manager. He's going to talk us through the report, covering the research model, findings, and next steps. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Helen. Yeah, as Helen mentioned, my name's Toby. I'll be walking us through this piece of research that we've carried out. Could we go to the next slide, please, Danielle? So what is this research all about? The key question we wanted to answer is how much difference do these one-to-one hours of support that Helen described, how much difference do they make for a client's likelihood of entering employment? So we've known that historically around a third of our clients to date have entered into employment, but yeah, we wanted to know how much difference we made to this figure and how many would have still entered employment without us. And of the clients that entered employment, the proportion that wouldn't have done so without our support is known in the sector as our attribution rate. But if possible, we wanted to go even more granular than that. We wanted to be able to quantify how much difference each hour of one-to-one support actually makes. And then in the process of doing that, we also wanted to uncover what other factors are important in determining whether a client has success in the labour market or not. Next slide, please, Danielle. So it's first worth talking a bit about why this is really challenging to do. And in order to understand that, we first need to talk about randomized control trials. So randomized control trials, a lot of you will have heard of, obviously originate in medicine, but they can also be used to evaluate how well a charity intervention is working, or whether a particular social policy is having the effects that it was planned to. The premise is you have a group of patients and you split them into a test group and a control group, where the test group receives the treatment and the control group does not, or receives a placebo. And in both groups, inevitably, some patients will recover. There's a background rate of recovery. But the key is the difference between the two groups. So if in your test group, lots more patients are recovering from their illness, that is a sign that the treatment is working and is effective. And the key is that you need to do a trial like this to really know whether a treatment is effective, because you need to, without a control group, you can't know what that background rate of recovery is. So in the charity sector, similarly, we can't precisely measure an attribution rate without running a randomized control trial. And this is where Breaking Barriers and other charities really struggle, because for ethical and practical reasons, we can't gather data from clients while withholding support from them in order to form a control group. And therefore, most charities don't know their attribution rate. This is really, really hard to do. Next slide, please. So this research is really seeing if we can find a way around this problem to explore this topic without having to be able to form that control group, which is so challenging to do. And we wanted to see whether machine learning could be an approach that would help us here. So what we did was we trained a machine learning model on our client data and set it to predict how likely each client was to enter employment based on the data we fed into it, looking at patterns in our historic data. And there's a little diagram on the right about how that would work. So you've got, it would take in some variables. For example, variable 1 is the client's age, and then variable 2 would be what their assessed English language was. Then you apply the model, and then that gives you a predicted probability of the event happening, which in this case is the client entering into employment. And one of the variables we'd feed into this model would be the number of hours of one-to-one support that the client has received. And then the model would give us back what's called the coefficient for that. What the value of each additional hour is. Once we've done that, we've got that value and we've established that relationship between hours and probability of employment, we can rerun the model on an imagined version of our data set where it's as if all the clients receive no support. So we've reset all of the number of support hours for all the clients to 0, and we ask the model to predict how many would have entered into employment in this scenario. And then we compare the results from this scenario to our actual number, to a number that actually entered employment, and that gives us our estimated attribution rate. Next slide, please. So before we go too much further, it's probably worth having a quick primer on machine learning and the different kinds of machine learning and how they work. Apologies for some of the audience, this will be familiar already. But in essence, machine learning is about applying statistical techniques to draw inferences from data. And what you're really doing is you're asking an algorithm to predict certain values of your values in your target variable. There's two main types, which you can see on the columns of this table. There's supervised and unsupervised. And this is about whether your training data that you're feeding into the model has examples for the model to follow in terms of the variable you're trying to predict. So in unsupervised machine learning models, there is no labeled training data. There is no example for the machine learning model to follow. The main example here is clustering, which is a kind of model which groups your data points together according to which ones are most similar and puts them into sort of buckets. This is what Spotify and Netflix or even Hinge or anything which has a recommendation engine in it, this is what's underpinning it. It's basically saying you are most like these other people, and therefore, because you're in the same bucket, you will also like what they've liked. On the other side of the fence, you have supervised machine learning models. So these are ones where your training data does contain examples, labeled data for the model to follow. Of those, you've got two different kinds of target variable. You've got a continuous variable, which is just numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. For these, you're going to want a linear or non-linear regression model. And then if your target variable is categorical, so for this, it could be, is something red or blue, or it could be, is this email spam or not, would be another example. You want a classification model. And this is what we want. We want a classification model because what we're trying to predict is a client going to be in the employed category or the not employed category? So yeah, we want to be in this bottom right-hand corner with our model. There's lots of types of classification models. There's decision trees, there's things called support vector machines, k-nearest neighbors model. But what we went with, so if you press the next slide, sorry, there's a little animation here showing this is where we should be. And then the next slide is logistic regression. So this is the model we've gone with. And this is a little chart just to show how it works. Logistic regression is one of the most common machine learning classification models. Essentially, on your x-axis, along the bottom, you have your predictor variables. This could be anything. This could be the number of years of previous experience your client has. And then the output of the model is on the y-axis, which is the estimated probability of an event happening, which in this case would be the probability that the client is going to get a job. And then the relationship between those two variables is the blue curve. So you can see as your predictor variable goes up, in this instance, then your probability would go up as well. You'll notice that the relationship between the two, the curve, is S-shaped, and that's because a probability can always has to be between 0 and 100%. You can't be minus 20% likely for something to happen or 150% likely for something to happen. So as you approach the values of 0 or 1, the curve flattens off, so it never crosses those values. So that gives you your first output, which is your probability of something happening. We then need to turn that into a yes, no. Is it going to happen or not? So in order to do that, you need to set what's called a prediction threshold, where this is this yellow dotted line through the middle, where you basically say any probability above that number, we'll say that counts as a yes, it's going to happen. And anything comes out below that number, we'll say, no, it's not going to happen. So in this example, any probability over 50%, we're going to say that counts as yes. Our most likely prediction is that a person is going to get a job. 0.5 is the default value for this, but that's not the best in every model. So you have to trial this to find the best value to be the most accurate. So this is a rough demonstration of how it works. The key thing is that in this example, we're only working with one predictor variable, but we want to take into account lots and lots of different information about the client, or to take a look at that client with lots of variables at once, and then to create our estimation of what's going to happen to that client. Excellent. So next slide, please. So to recap, we've chosen a model. We are going to set it to predict the likelihood of a client entering employment, and then use that to predict how much difference each hour of one-to-one support makes. And from there, going to estimate how many clients wouldn't have entered into employment without us, which all sounds really, really great. But there are some big limitations. And before we go any further, we should really focus on the limitations of this approach. And the biggest one, which is in bold at the top, is we can't firmly establish causation without running a randomized control trial. As I mentioned earlier, we can only look at correlations in the data. And the key thing here is that it could be that clients are more likely to enter into employment and more likely to do more hours of one-to-one support for an unrelated third reason. It might be that whatever makes them more likely to engage in employment also makes them more likely to engage in our support, and the model can't necessarily pick up on that. So yeah, we can't definitively establish causation. This is only an estimate, and we need to bear that in mind when looking at the results. There's other limitations as well. So the first thing we need to highlight, this is only looking at employment outcomes, and that's not all of what Breaking Barriers does. We also help our clients enter into education and training, particularly things like university courses. That's going to not be picked up by this methodology. Similarly, for simplicity, this model is only looking at unemployed clients entering into employment, but a fair portion of our clients come to us already in work, but want to find employment that better matches their skill set and their experience. So they're underemployed. Those clients are excluded from this model as well. Next, the model doesn't take into account our work with corporate partners. This is really, really important. Obviously, on both sides, on our side and on the corporate partner side, a lot of work goes into creating placements, like structured placements for clients to step into. That has a huge impact. But just because of the nature of this model, and because that work isn't delivered on a per client basis in terms of the hours involved, it's really hard to build into a model like this. So we've had to exclude it and not take it into account. Similarly, clients attend workshops and education classes and other activities, as Helen mentioned when going through our support model at the start. Those activities aren't included either. This is because the average client hasn't attended enough workshop hours for the model to be sensitive enough to pick it up, and because things like learning English takes such a different timescale to something like entering employment for a client who already knows English. The timescales are so different that you can't put these in the same model very easily. The model doesn't consider the work other organizations are doing in supporting our clients. Other refugee charities do brilliant work, and we don't have good enough data to include that. Also, the model considers employment as a binary. It's a yes, no. Did you get a job or did you not? That doesn't take into account the salary, the seniority, and the job satisfaction and the nature of that job, which is obviously really, really important for how much impact that job has on a client's well-being. And finally, this is the estimating the probability of employment during the time period which we have data. So when the client is on the program, it's not saying for all time. So if the model estimates, yes, without us, this client wouldn't have gotten a job, that's saying they wouldn't have gotten a job for the time period where we have data on them. It's not saying that they would never ever get a job, because that's again not possible. So yeah, there's some really important limitations here that we have to bear in mind when talking about this approach. And then there's one other big limitation, which is during the middle of our data gathering period, if you can remember, there was a global pandemic. And this obviously had a huge impact on hiring patterns around the world. And if, depending on when a client was on the program, that's going to make it much harder for them to get a job. If you're in lockdown, there's just less jobs going. So this chart, which demonstrates that, it shows data from Adzuna and the ONS on the number of vacancies per week. And if, Danielle, you press the button, you should be able to see a big drop, which is COVID. And so we tried to correct for this by incorporating this data into our model and tried to bring data in various ways on how many jobs there were available at the time the client was on the program into our model to make it more accurate. And I'll come back to that later. So next slide, please. So we have gone through the limitations and the methodology. How did we actually build the model? And this bit does get a bit technical, so apologies if that's not something of interest. I'll try to go through quite quickly. So first of all, we got our data set, which included all clients that were unemployed when they came to us, when they enrolled with us, from the financial years 2019 to 2022, which is a data set of 825 clients. We only went back to financial year 2019 because before that, some of the key variables we wanted to include in the model weren't gathered. And a quick note on the size. So 825 clients is a really high number of clients for a small charity like Breaking Barriers. But for a model like this, it's a really small data set. These models work best with tens of thousands of data points. So that, again, is going to come back and affect the accuracy. And then we only loaded into the model the hours of one-to-one support that occurred before the client achieved their first employment outcome, obviously, because at the time they did afterwards can't affect, that whether they got that job. We transformed all the categorical data in the data set into numerical values, so the model could work with them and do calculations. We then cleaned the data to remove outliers and replace blanks. There's more detail on how we did this in the report itself, if you'd be interested in that. The key thing here is that we did it in such a way to maintain the data set size. So we weren't removing values, we were imputing values to make sure that we kept as much data as we could. Then it became about variable selection. So then it was basically trying all of the different variables in every single possible way to see which were the most informative and which were the best predictors. Again, we don't have time to go into the detail on this, but there's more detail in the report. But we tried transforming each variable in lots of different ways to see if different versions and different calculations were better predictors. We looked at interaction terms to see if any two variables interacted with each other and to make them more predictive in combination than they were on their own. And finally, we did some multicollinearity checks, which basically looks for whether any two variables are very closely correlated with each other, because that can mess up our model. And then once we had done that, it was about trialing lots and lots of different combinations of variables to find the most effective combination of variables for making predictions. Again, more detail on how we did that in the report. Once we had our model with our most effective set of variables selected, it then became about that prediction threshold that I mentioned earlier, trying to find the best value for the prediction threshold. So we tried basically every possible prediction threshold between 0 and 1, tested it against various performance criteria, and you can see the results of some of those on the right, and then found the optimum threshold value, which in our case was 0.37. So anything with a probability above 0.37 is going to be classified as a yes. Then finally, we reran the model with our preferred variables and our optimum threshold 1,000 times with different samples from our data set, resampling every time. to see how it performed on different situations. And then the results that we are going to be talking about are the averages from those 1,000 different samples. And then also this gives us confidence intervals as well. So we can look at the range of like how much variation is there in those 1,000 different results to look at how confident we are. So yeah, we did a lot of testing with it to then make sure that it is as accurate as it can be. Next slide, please. So with all of that, did it work? So this is this table in this slide shows various measures to show how well the model worked in its predictions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through them all, but there's more discussion again in the report, and this table is in the report if you'd like to look through it in more detail. The key is that the model is being trialed against unseen data. So in any model you train, you have a portion of your data that you use for training, and then a portion that you hold back that you then show the model to see how well it does against new data, and this prevents the model being overfitted, essentially. And the key takeaway here is that against when being tested against unseen data, the model does significantly better than random guessing. It is picking up on real trends in the data and showing and giving us real information. However, there is still a lot of scope for error, and that's because essentially getting a job is very hard to predict. There's a lot of chance involved, a lot of things, even like interpersonal chemistry between an interviewer and a client, which are really hard to predict based on the data we have. It's not as rule-based and simple as something like telling whether an email is spam, which is like something that a classification model is often used for. And then also because our data set, as we mentioned, is quite small and could be more granular in terms of the data we have. So there's a lot of room for error, and we should also, again, bear that in mind when talking about the results of this. But as I mentioned, it is still telling us real trends in the data. It's doing significantly better than some model that would that would predict at random. So that's the evaluation. Next slide, please. We're going to get to the exciting part, results. And again, just before we go on to discussing the results in any more detail, caveats. Firstly, these findings are estimates, not measurements. And these are outputs of a predictive model, not things that we know definitely haven't happened. And secondly, as just mentioned, the accuracy of this model is not flawless. There is a large scope for error. So yeah, please do bear those in mind as we go through the results. Next slide, please. So breaking barriers impact. This is what the model was telling us. On the chart on the right, you can see the number of one-to-one support hours received on the x-axis, and then the model's estimated probability of employment on the right axis. And then you can see the dark line is the model's core estimate of the probability of entering employment at each point. And then the shaded area around that is a 95% confidence interval. So we could be 95%. We are saying that we're 95% confident that the true value is somewhere in that shaded area. And our best guess is the dark line. How we generated this is that we basically reran the model on the average client. So the client who has the average value for every variable, apart from one-to-one support hours, which we varied by 1 each time. So we ran it on a client with 1 hour and then 2 hours and then 3 hours and then 4 hours, with everything else being kept equal, and then the model told us what it thought the probability would be at each point. So the key takeaways here: before receiving any support, the average client had a 7% probability of entering employment. After 3 hours, that probability has nearly doubled to 13%. And after 8 hours, it's more than tripled to 22%. And this is the key figure that we're really proud of. It's that 8-hour figure, it's more than tripled. And if a client were to carry on to 22 hours, only a minority of clients ever reach that number of hours of support. If they did, it reaches 36% estimated probability of entering employment. The model then also estimated that 80% of employment outcomes would not have happened without this one-to-one support from breaking barriers. So this is a 80% estimated attribution rate. Our 95% confidence intervals for that figure is between 69 and 89%. And then the other thing, just to quickly note, is that the model is estimating that there's a faster rate of increase in probability of employment for those first 8 hours. You can see that on the graph. There's a steeper curve for those first 8 hours, and then it flattens off slightly. So we're seeing a diminishing return on investment after 8 hours, but then a very high return in those first 8 hours. Again, why this is the case and the extent to which this is the case is needs more investigation, but it's potentially something that could be of interest for us. So that's our impact out of the way. Next, we should have a quick look at other findings. What other variables were important for the model? And again, these graphs in this section are generated in the same using the same methodology as the graphs on breaking barriers impact. So we're going to be feeding the client with the average value for every variable into the model, and then only varying the variable of interest. So for example, the graph on the right is looking at the number of interviews the client has had before they enrolled. We'll only be varying that and seeing what the model says the probability of entering employment is. The interesting thing about this is that a lot of this is affirming information that we knew we'd like. So we know, for example, that if a client had already been looking for a job, then those clients are more likely to have a successful outcome. But this lets us do that controlling for every other variable and saying, if you look at this one variable in isolation, how much difference does that on its own do, which is something that we've not really looked at before in much detail. So the first area of interest is prior job hunting experience. And so this is looking at whether the client has already made a start they're looking for a job by the time they enroll with us. This is, again, pretty intuitive that this does make a difference. That extra time and experience does make a difference. So on the left, you can see a chart of the estimated probability of employment by whether they were job seeking or not. And you can see that if they were already job seeking when they enrolled, they have a much higher chance of success. On the right, you can see the estimated probability based on the number of interviews they had in English before they enrolled. So if they've already had an interview or two, then they are significantly more likely to enter employment after they enroll. Next slide, please. Education and language. So this slide is really interesting. On the left, we have clients by how well they speak English. Their self-reported English speaking CEFA level, which goes from none to basic to independent to proficient. And you can see this really nice curve, which as they go up, the English language speaking levels, as we'd expect, their estimated probability of employment goes up. So that's relatively unsurprising. But then we looked at education in other areas, and here there were some more surprising relationships. What was particularly surprising was essentially that almost no levels of education made any statistically significant difference in the model. And so, yeah, they didn't make it as variables that were good predictors, with the exception of whether the client has a postgraduate degree or not. But that relationship didn't flow in the way that we thought it would. Essentially, if a client has a postgraduate degree, the model estimated they were less likely to enter employment than the clients who didn't have a postgraduate degree, which is, again, backwards considering what you'd expect. The only explanation we could have for this is potentially that those clients are, with a much higher level of qualifications, are only going for more competitive, high-level jobs, and so they're willing to take longer to get those jobs. But again, this would require more research to be sure. Next slide, please. Homelessness and mental health, obviously really, really important variables and really big issues that affect many of our clients. And again, there's no surprises here in the kind of relationships. Clients that are homeless have a lower likelihood of entering employment, and clients that reported mental health issues have a lower likelihood of entering into employment. It's worth noting that this is self-reported mental health issues, and therefore, just due to the stigma around mental health, it's likely that we're under-reporting the clients who have mental health issues. So there's potentially some issues in that data, but we're still picking up on a real trend in terms of the clients who do say they're experiencing this. It definitely is a barrier to them entering into employment successfully. This one is also very interesting as well, and unexpected. Country of origin. Now, the issue with country of origin is there are so many. In this data set, there were over 60 different countries of origin for our clients. We couldn't test all of them, there's just too many. So we just looked at the 5 most common. And of those, 2 came out as statistically significant predictors of a client's probability of entering employment. One was whether the client was Syrian, and we found that clients from Syria had a higher than average probability of finding a job. And the other was whether the client was Eritrean, and we found that clients who are Eritrean have a lower than average likelihood of getting a job. But we don't know why this is. So this is something that, again, requires more looking into before we can really make any confident assertions about what's going on here. But it was definitely an interesting finding. Then we have some unexpected results. And first of all, there's some variables which we potentially expected would be important in the model, and then the model couldn't find any statistically significant relationships for those. And these include a client's gender, a client's sexual identity, and whether a client has caring responsibilities. And this is not to say that these variables don't make a difference. It's just to say that our model isn't picking up on any trends in our data. And the effects aren't statistically significant at a level that we can include. So that was something that's surprising. That was surprising. Next, the model estimated that clients who do have immediate family in the UK had a lower estimated probability of employment than clients who don't have immediate family. And again, this is flowing in the opposite direction to what we would expect. We'd expect immediate family in the UK to be an advantage and a source of support, but the model wasn't bearing that out. Next, we've already mentioned that breaking barriers doesn't just help clients into employment. There's non-employment outcomes that we take into account as well, that we support clients towards as well. Things like going to university, entering into a training course. And we found that clients who, before they entered employment, achieved one of these non-employment outcomes, actually had a lower estimated probability of employment than the clients who didn't have one of these outcomes. And again, so this is potentially surprising, but one potential explanation for this is that if a client is taking on a really demanding course, maybe like a university degree or something like that, in the short term, that's going to potentially reduce their availability to take on work because of the time demands. But in the long term, that will probably increase their employability. So yeah, but clients with these non-employment outcomes had a lower estimated probability of employment. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we attempted to incorporate the number of job vacancies that were available when a client was on the program into our model, so we could control for some of the effects of the pandemic. And we did this in various different ways. We included jobs in different sectors. We looked at the average number of jobs per week when a client was on the program, the high point, so the maximum number of jobs per week where a client was on the program. So there's lots of different ways of slicing this data, and we found that most of these different variables behaved exactly as you would expect. That the more jobs were available, the more at the time, the more likely a client was to get a job. But not all of them did. And some had really statistically significant impacts in a way that we didn't expect. And so this chart on the left shows one of those. So this is hospitality sector vacancies while the client was on the program. And as you can see, the more vacancies, the lower the estimated probability of employment. At the moment, we do not have a way of explaining why this is the case. So yeah, it needs looking into in more detail. All of these unexpected findings could reflect real trends that are reflective of client experiences, or these could simply be noise in the data, and this could reflect the fact that our data set is not enormous, and as we gather more data and our model gets and the data we gather gets more granular, our model will improve, and some of these relationships might sort of melt away and no longer be present in the model as we improve our ability to do this sort of work. Which then leads on to next steps, hopefully. Yes. So this research represents our first attempt at doing this, basically, the first attempt to model the impact of our programs in this way. And the model did display moderate levels of accuracy, and for obvious reasons, we're really happy with the results and what it says about our work, but there's definitely still a lot of room for improvement in this work, and we're going to keep working in this area. So we're going to, of course, as we grow, expand our data set, gather new information, and also gather more granular data, and that will over time improve the accuracy of our models and our ability to do this sort of work. We can also expand the remit of this kind of work to use a similar approach in other aspects of our work, for example, in education programs or on workshops. And also we want to be able to apply the outputs of this sort of research to identify clients in most need of additional support and then fine tune our programs. So we're feeding this back into our program design and improving our impact. So I think that should be the ends of the slides, which leaves plenty of time for questions if anyone has any. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
I think there might be, so Danielle will hopefully be posting questions in the chat and I can have a look. Or Danielle, you could read them potentially.
Yeah, it might be easier than lots of shenanigans in the background. So we have a question from a funder at the AKO Foundation, which was, if you apply the model and realize that the client probability of employment is low, would there be any other analysis to suggest why the probability is low, as this approach might increase the efficiency of your work? Just also wondering if this would also reduce the cost as well, and if so, by what percentage? Hopefully you understand that, Toby.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if I end up barking up the wrong tree, then hopefully whoever asked that can shout and direct me in the right direction. But yeah, in essence, the model will return what it thinks the value of each variable is. So how much difference, as you saw, how much difference does education make? How much difference does English language make? Things like that. And so that when we can look at that client and go, okay, it's giving them a really low estimated probability of employment, we can look at that client's traits and figure out why the model thinks that. Essentially, obviously it doesn't think, but why the model is giving us that output. Again, obviously the accuracy of the model is moderate. It's not that client is definitely not, it doesn't have a hope of getting employment. It's just an estimated probability. The key thing as well is that we wouldn't ever want to then say that client is a lower return on investment for us, so we're not going to support them. It's more about saying, okay, this is a key variable which is going to make a really big difference in someone's likelihood. Can we tailor our support to support the client with that in that area? So that's the way that this would work. Does that answer the question? Hopefully.
Hope so. I think the funder had to leave, but we're going to obviously share the recording with them afterwards, so they might come back with a follow-up question. If people have questions, then feel free to put their hand up and I can unmute you on live, or you could also put them in the chat.
Sanya has put a question.
Yeah, should I read it out to you, or are you okay?
Let me just have a read.
I can put it in the chat so other people can see.
Okay, it's quite a long question. So I'll read it out. So you've already taken into consideration various aspects such as COVID. Do we also take into account other aspects such as focusing on specific sectors and industries, including shortage occupation skills? And does this change things in terms of hiring patterns? Would these stats be any different if we included all other jobs? Does the background of the person supporting the clients matter? And would having this information and including it help to improve a future statistical model? Great questions. So firstly on the specific sectors and industries, we do have data on this. So we have the sectors and industries and occupations that a client has experience in, the kind of job they're looking for, and then the kind of job they get if they're on the program. It's really hard to build into a model like this just because there are so many sectors and industries. There's so many different things that someone can do, and you have to look at the impact of these as like one variable at a time. So for example, is it in law? Yes, no. Is it in accountancy? Yes, no. And in each of those individual sectors, the size of the data set starts getting very small. So you might only have a number of clients interested in working in law that is not meaningful, and the model will start picking up on lots of noise. So yeah, we do have that data, but really hard to use in this way. The next one was the background of the person providing support to the client. Again, we do sort of have that data. It's not been put into the model. It's very hard to work with, and that's not least because a client might be supported by multiple people, that we have volunteers that would work with a client, or that they might change employment advisor over time. So again, really hard to work with, but it's theoretically possible, but not in this instance. Any more questions?
Cool. Yeah, so we'll share, I think that was the last question. But if anybody has any more questions, please feel free to reach out to Toby and he'll be happy to answer. We also encourage you to read the report, which will have a lot more insight for you. We'll be sharing the recording and also the full report on our website, and we'll circulate the link later this afternoon. Thank you so much for attending, and Toby, thank you so much for a very comprehensive presentation. Thank you, everybody. Have a great lunch.
Everyone.
Thank you.